I'm Jansen Hale, Media Relations Associate at the National Congress of American Indians. Welcome to NCAI's Tribal Leader Town Hall on the historic Reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act. I'd like to take a moment to share with you a few housekeeping items before we begin today's presentation. For optimal viewing, please use Zoom in speaker mode. This option is found at the top right of your screen under the View button. Next, if you'd like to ask a question throughout the program, you may insert your question in the Q&A box at any time, and the moderator will read chosen questions aloud during the Q&A portion of the town hall. Please note that due to time constraints, we may not get to every question. However, NCAI staff will gather all questions and will follow up as necessary. We appreciate your understanding. And finally, please note that this session is being recorded. If you experience technical issues, please reach out to NCAI staff for support. Once again, on behalf of the National Congress of American Indians, welcome to today's presentation.
Please welcome Dante Desiderio, Chief Executive Officer, National Congress of American Indians.
Yaqui, welcome to the NCAI Tribal Leader Town Hall on Violence Against Women Act. I'm Dante Desiderio, member of the Saponi and Chief Executive Officer of the National Congress of American Indians. Today, we're gathered to celebrate our recent victory in passing the 2022 Violence Against Women Act. Dive deeper into the language of VAWA and look forward to what's next for Indian country. Before we begin our celebration, I'd like to take a few moments or ask for a few moments of silence to acknowledge and recognize all of our relatives that we've lost to violence over the years. It's important that we hold space for their memory as we move forward. Please join me now in a moment of silence. Thank you for joining in that moment. I'd now like to continue starting us off in a good way by handing this over to Chief Mike Williams to provide our opening prayer. Chief Williams is from the Akiak Native community and also serves as our NCAI Alaska Regional Vice President. Chief Williams, the floor is yours.
Good morning. Good morning from Akiak, Alaska, and I just I'm honored to do the invocation this morning, and we just had 2 years of real challenges up here with COVID, and prior to that, the issue of violence against our women and children and elders, and general violence in our community with lack of police protection, and we have been suffering along here in Alaska, and but these recent developments answer our prayers for to start addressing and strengthening our tribal governments in Alaska and all of Indian country. And I just really appreciate all of the support that we had over the long years. And we have much work to do to continue to address our issues through our guidance from our Creator, who oversees everything. And I will do this prayer in my language, and please pray in your own way. And with the recent loss of Honorable Congressman Don Young, we just think of him and his family and all of those people that we have been losing in recent times. So I just really appreciate the moment of silence, Dante, and again, I will pray in my own language, and please pray in your own way. Avayna David Kalegamatami, Kawakam Kanjali, Kanak Dam Chikapkut, Chingulu Kuani, Asilingum Nakawarit now, Kujali, Kutwani, Jalach Kaput, Tunduki, Tawam, Auduknat, and Jali, Ukuchalis, Jali Laritwani, Chile Kaknat, and Pinim, Kuchiki, Maluki, Jali. Agan kasu tamtlata tanga kun pasha asatun tama kutwani awagana atin jali mani kwani agan kasu lam tasu nunam ni tama kutwani isfinit lukis tawama udukna atin jali pichogole kwanlan ispitawam dauna pichogole kwani abik na agan kwankutnik jali awduksuta unnoqoqan anguyalritluchali akmani ispitwani awduknaaradn chali
Chief Williams, can you still hear us? Well, hopefully Chief Williams can come back with us, and we appreciate the prayer that we have heard and recognize all those in the moment of silence. So with all due respect, Chief Williams, do you mind finishing your prayer? I think you've come back to us. Well, for this.
Yes, good morning.
Okay, great.
Dante, I prayed in my own way, and I just having internet issues now, but we are praying for everyone all throughout the Indian country, and especially here in Alaska, that we have had 2 tough years with COVID-19 and also the violence against women over the years. And we have made tremendous progress, and this will help us to deal with this issue in a more empowered way in our communities that are going to be dealing with this issue, and it will in a long run our prayers to make it permanent. So I will pray in my own language, and please pray in your own way. Jali ukutwani jallah put spinentun tunluki spitawam chiulakakna put koya uksitin amsanik chikyu tunek jali unakwani tanyang aka yunrila mani congressman not put echeneri pitkarai sus tauduknarat and tamasquita. Jali ukutwani tamaris put jali spitawluknarat Koya uksit namsan chikki tunik jali ukuchalach kaput atakwachnaten unnom jali ukuni ashakuni talani jali chilakakna koya uksit nipani jachangwan pichakut Jesus amen that happen. Amen. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief Williams, for the blessing. For this, the Violence Against Women Act Reauthorization of 2022 is a monumental piece of legislation for Indian country. The restoration of tribal jurisdiction will become a cornerstone for many nations, ensuring their communities are safe, and healthy going forward. Today, we must celebrate this tremendous win for Indian country, and I'm happy to welcome many of our tribal leaders and allies that have helped bring this important law from the drafting table to the president's desk. With that being said, let's head into our first of 3 segments today, celebrating the VAWA reauthorization. And for this segment, I would like to first introduce the treasurer of the National Congress of American Indians, Shannon Holsey, who's also the president of the Stockbridge-Munsee Band of Mohican Indians. Treasurer Holsey serves as the co-chair for the NCAI Task Force on Violence Against Women. As co-chair, she has spearheaded our VAWA efforts by connecting with tribal leaders and grassroots advocates to help identify the gaps that are needed to be filled in this most recent VAWA reauthorization. She continued to raise the needs of Indian women and children during almost all federal engagements and brought together strong advocates from across the country to reauthorize VAWA with the historic tribal provisions that we have today. I'm pleased to hand this over to Treasurer Holsey. President Holsey.
Good morning or good afternoon. Thank you so much, CEO Desiderio, and thank you, Chief Williams, for those phenomenal good words and the reminder of Legislator Young and all that have really significantly contributed to this insurmountable endeavor. You know, I want to take an opportunity also to thank all of our survivors, tribal leaders, allies, and advocates that have really joined us on this important celebration. Today, we celebrate the restoration of our sovereign rights to protect our tribal communities and really to keep our relatives safe and really to, and most importantly, to hold bad actors accountable in our tribal justice systems, which not only further affirms and recognizes our native tribal inherent powers of self-government, it also includes our inherent power to exercise those special domestic criminal jurisdictions over all persons and further strengthens our sovereignty. You know, we have, I think you can all agree, overcome some insurmountable odds, not only to have VAWA reauthorized this year, but really to have it include bold tribal provisions, bold provisions that not only restore our jurisdiction over non-Indians, but further commits, but also that further commit crimes of domestic violence, dating violence, child violence, sexual assault, sex trafficking, stalking, obstruction of justice, and assault of tribal justice personnel. These bold provisions really ensure that tribal nations from Maine to Alaska will be able to hold long-time offenders of these crimes accountable for the very first time in decades and really provide significantly more resources for tribal justice systems. I must say though, rather than allowing the fear of the unauthorization drive efforts for VAWA, Indian country really took and focused its attention on meaningful enhancements and fostering champions like Senator Murkowski and Schatz, humanitarian Angelina, Jolie. Of course, we can't forget our fierce Andes, organizations and grassroots efforts who really helped us get to the finish line. Specifically, provisions that would really be needed to help us address those jurisdictional gaps you heard Dante talk about, and to continue to help us leave Native communities that less vulnerable to extremely high rates of violence. One of the most driving forces of President Biden's career has been fighting against or back against abuses of power. That force really led him to write and champion what we experienced just last week, the groundbreaking Violence Against Women's Act reauthorization. And just to look at a snapshot or flashpoint in history, he did this as a US Senator, and he brought this landmark legislation that first passed in 1994. And it was nearly 3 decades since he had worked with members of Congress from both parties to help legislation renew and strengthen VAWA 3 times in 2000, 2005, and 2013. Each time he worked to expand access to safety and support of all survivors and increase prevention efforts, preventing and responding to gender-based violence wherever it occurs. And in all of its forms, he has remained a cornerstone. It has remained a cornerstone of our president's career in public service. from VAWA reauthorization to a national campaign to combat all types of sexual assault and to reform and address sexual assault and violence against our people, with our people, and with our inclusion. Since the establishment of NCAI's Task Force on Violence Against Women in 2003, enhancing the safety of Indian women has been a critical focus of NCAI's work. For almost 2 decades, NCAI has collaborated with survivors, tribal nations, grassroots advocates, allies, and domestic violence providers to learn about the needs in Indian country, and certainly to work together to change federal policy. As the treasurer of NCAI and humble co-chair of the NCAI task force, I am so pleased to share that our commitment to the safety and security of Indian women and our people in all Indian country will not waver. We will continue to do the important work alongside all of you until the day comes when the epidemic of violence against American Indian, Alaska Native people will stop. We certainly must continue to strive to fix federal policies that are broken and certainly create new ones that promote the health and safety of every person in Indian country. We also must continue to build strong relationships and allies and champions in Congress and in the federal government to effect positive change. We must not forget that that coming together as tribal nations and as tribal citizens to advocate for ourselves is an insurmountable and powerful force, just as we noticed as of last week with the reauthorization of VAWA, a force that we must continue to use to make this reauthorization a reality. I just want to thank all of those on our town hall today and those that aren't with us, and those in the audience whose passion and dedication have really made this reauthorization possible, and it could not have happened without all of you. We must really continue to walk in our joint power together or collective even power together to continue to make important strides for ourselves and the next generations that will come after us. Since VAWA's reauthorization in 2013, tribal nations have increased safety and justice for survivors in Indian country who had previously seen little or of either. But I have no doubt that after this VAWA reauthorization, even more tribal nations will hold perpetuators accountable, provide resources for survivors, and really continue to make Indian country safer for everyone. I so much look forward to working with survivors, tribal nations, tribal citizens to help implement VAWA in 2022 in our communities and identify the next steps we need to make VAWA even stronger in 2027. And as Chief Williams said, perhaps a permanent fix to everything that we need for health and safety of our tribal citizens. As you are well aware, many of these issues transact, and befitting of the day of the reauthorization was actually the birthday of my VAWA co-chair, Dr. Juana Mahal Dixon, who has embodied this as her charge and her body of work in helping bring health and bringing these issues forward and collectively collaborating with all different champions to help see this to reality. I can imagine what a birthday celebration she had on that day. And really almost a year ago on today or around this time was International Women's Day in 2021, when President Biden signed an executive order creating a White House, for the first time, a White House Gender Policy Council, and calling for a development of a first ever government-wide national action plan to end gender-based violence, as well as an update to the 2016 United States strategy to prevent and to respond to gender-based violence globally. These strategies, including the VAWA reauthorization, will really provide a roadmap to guide President Biden's administration's whole of government effort to end gender-based violence. And in doing so, create a society where survivors are supported and all people can live free of abuse. We certainly know that there is much work to do. And today you will hear directly from some of those champions as we begin to unpack and strategize collectively the bill that requires the US Department of Justice and others to work with our tribal nations in creating national databases for our missing and murdered Indigenous people, and expand some of the sharing of that data with tribes to really help us stand up and have access to safety for our people. I so much look forward to our unveiling of our champions today and collectively working together with all of you in bringing health and necessary safety to all of our tribal communities. A sincere anishik to all of you and all the work that you've done. And I look forward and an exciting opportunity for all of us as we move into the future. Anishik.
Thank you, President Holsey. And next, we're going to welcome Senator Lisa Murkowski, Vice Chairman of the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs. Since joining the Senate in 2002, Senator Murkowski has worked tirelessly for Indian country and has earned a reputation in the Senate for her ability to work collaboratively and across the aisle to reach common sense solutions. The strong tribal provisions in VAWA, and in particular the Alaska Pilot Project, which restores tribal jurisdiction to certain Alaska Native villages, is a perfect example of her bipartisan efforts and her work on behalf of Indian country. Her tireless work as a key co-sponsor of the law ensured that Native women and children across Indian country can access justice where they had little or none before. I'm proud to welcome Senator Lisa Murkowski here today to join the celebration of this historic piece of legislation. Senator Murkowski.
Dante, thank you. It's good to be with you, good to be with NCAI, and it's good to be part of a town hall where this is about celebration. And it has been a long, long time. I also want to acknowledge my friend, Chief Mike Williams. Mike, we need to work on that broadband to make sure that that you have good, or certainly better connectivity out there, but it's good to see you. And thank you for acknowledging our Congressman for All Alaska, Don Young, who left us this weekend. As I think about the Violence Against Women Act of Reauthorization and the special tribal jurisdiction project that we have been working on, I acknowledge that the Congressman has been working on this initiative on the House side for years as well, and his great contributions. So we are keeping him in our thoughts, and his family in our prayers as well. It was good last week. It was great last week to be at the White House in the East Room and to see so many gathered to recognize VAWA as it was being celebrated and signed into law. I think it is important for folks to recognize that the way that we were able to advance the provisions, particularly the tribal title in VAWA, was through a very open, inclusive, and transparent process. We worked that bill through our committee led by Chairman Schatz, but being able to incorporate that as part of the broader VAWA package that allowed for strong support in the United States Senate with 68 votes was very significant. And I acknowledge and recognize the dedication and the leadership of all the many advocates, and particularly our tribal advocates who shared their stories, who worked with us to draft a strong tribal title. Debra O'Gara, who is on your agenda today, along with her colleagues, so many others in Alaska who provided critical testimony and input as we worked on ways to strengthen and improve VAWA for Native women and children. The issue, as we all know, of violence, especially in my state of Alaska, it is one that keeps me awake at night. Half of the women in Alaska have reported experiencing intimate partner sexual violence or both. The statistics regarding Indigenous women on tribal lands and Native villages are particularly horrific as we continue to see the highest rate of forcible sexual assault and reported rates of domestic violence, up to 10 times higher on Alaska Native women or with Alaska Native women than the national average, when more than 1 out of 5 Native young people, children, suffer from PTSD due to childhood exposure to violence. We know that we must address this. We must address it. And that was why the effort that was made, we all recognize that there was compromise that was made. This was a bill that, as important as it is, was not the perfect one in many ways, but we knew we needed to get this act reauthorized. It has been expired now since 2018, and further impasse was simply not a viable option. And so we did our part in the Indian Affairs Committee, and again, building a strong tribal title that will continue to empower tribal courts to help combat this major public safety issue affecting Native people and children. And we all know that matters of tribal jurisdiction can be confusing, perhaps esoteric, particularly in Alaska, but we also recognize that they simply cannot deny safety or justice. And that's exactly what we have seen happen. So making sure that Alaska was part of this VAWA reauthorization, recognizing that we have unique and complex jurisdictional landscapes in our state because of ANCSA, we needed to work to address this. And so, unlike 2013, we have now an Alaska solution to this jurisdictional maze. We call it the Alaska Public Safety Empowerment Pilot Program that we have included. And again, it was built around and with the work of my friend, Congressman Young, who had championed this in the House when we were considering VAWA back in 2019. But it is the product of years of work with tribal advocates, the Department of Justice, and some pretty smart lawyers out there. But it will supplement the work of the state of Alaska that they are doing with regards to public service safety. But I am certain, I'm confident that our Alaska tribes are up to this job, up to the responsibility. They will be good partners with the state to make a positive difference in the safety of our Native communities, just like we've seen the tribes in the lower 48 do. So as we celebrate the reauthorization of VAWA, I want to take just a moment and also pay tribute to those who've shown bravery and strength in the wake of unspeakable trauma. We have acknowledged that March is also Women's History Month. So in addition to acknowledging the legacies of strong and resilient Indigenous women, we also know that we must continue to support tribal governments in creating safer communities for women and the most vulnerable in Indian country and Native villages. So we have done good work together. I am pleased to have been part of this extraordinary partnership, and I look forward to the successful implementation of this historic law. So thank you to the many, many, many who have taken us to where we are today. Thank you. Gunesh Chish.
Senator Murkowski, our heartfelt gratitude goes out to you for everything that you have put into this, and we look forward to working with you to make the pilot program broadened and also building on the success we've had today. So thank you for everything.
Thank you.
So on our next, I want to introduce a message from Senator Brian Schatz, Chairman of the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs. Since joining the Senate, Senator Schatz has focused on his work in helping workers, veterans, and families, and has led key legislation on Indian country issues, including healthcare, climate change, and technology. Senator Schatz's leadership and support of the historic tribal provisions during the VAWA negotiations were important to ensure that no tribal nation was left behind in this reauthorization. So we want to turn it over to Senator Schatz.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm so honored to join you today to thank you for your help in reauthorizing the Violence Against Women Act. Because of your hard work and your tenacious advocacy, VAWA was enacted with historic tribal provisions for Native communities. Our bipartisan bill maintains tribal jurisdiction from the 2013 law and restores it to cover more crimes committed by non-Indian offenders. This bill ensures parity for all tribes, including Alaska and Maine, and it improves tribal access to federal resources, giving tribes more tools to keep Native women, children, and families safe. VAWA's passage makes clear that your partnership with the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs is as important and powerful as ever. Vice Chairman Murkowski and I could not have gotten this done without all of you. So thanks for all you do, and I look forward to continuing our great work together to support Native communities. Mahalo and aloha.
And thank you to Senator Schatz for all of his work in making sure this got carried over the finish line. And our next message comes from a strong ally of Native survivors of violence, their families, and tribal nations. Please join me in welcoming international human rights and children's rights advocate, Angelina Jolie. Angelina has advocated for children's rights globally for decades and is working to support domestic violence survivors here in the United States, particularly focusing on the negative health impacts of overlooked and failing to treat trauma, and has advocated for improved legal and medical responses. For the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act, she advocated for the inclusion of Caden's Law, non-biased forensic evidence collection, tribal sovereignty, and other protections for vulnerable populations. In 2021, Angelina has worked with NCAI and the National Indian Women's Resource Center to learn more about the epidemic of violence against women, filled gaps left in the law. She brought national attention to the tribal provisions in the monumental bill and has sent a message for our celebration today. Angelina?
Good afternoon, and thank you so much for inviting me to join you today. I want to acknowledge first that I am speaking from the homeland lands of the Santillanes Band of Chumash Indians, Kizh Nation, and Gabrielino Tongva Nation. And I want to say how honored I am to be able to support and acknowledge the extraordinary tribal survivors, families, and leaders who worked to achieve the Reauthorization of Violence Against Women Act. The tribal provisions in the new law are monumental. Thanks to your efforts, they will enable tribal nations across the country to hold non-Indian perpetrators of child violence, sexual assault, sex trafficking, stalking, obstruction of justice, assault of tribal justice personnel, dating violence, and domestic violence crimes accountable for the first time in almost half a century as part of your inherent and sovereign right to protect your communities. Many Americans don't know the high rates of violence in Indian country. They don't know that more than 4 in 5 American Indian and Alaskan Native women have experienced intimate partner violence, sexual violence, or stalking in their lifetimes, and that 91% of those victims experienced violence at the hands of a non-Indian perpetrator. And they are not aware that these high rates of violence are, of course, not an accident. The violence was allowed to grow due to the restrictions that Congress and the Supreme Court placed on tribal nations, making them unable to hold perpetrators accountable when they attacked Indian women and children in Indian country. When tribal nations are prevented from upholding justice at the local level, victims are forced to rely on a federal court system and prosecutors, frequently hundreds of miles away from the communities where they were attacked, and that often decline to prosecute. As you know, U.S. attorneys decline to prosecute nearly 52% of violent crimes that occur in Indian country, leaving many victims and their families without justice. The provisions in the new law set out to address this and to ensure that all tribal nations, including those in Alaska and Maine, were not left behind in this reauthorization. I have learned so much working with the National Congress of American Indians and National Indigenous Women's Resource Center, and I am so grateful to have been able to partner with Kelbie Kennedy and Carrie Colfer. I know that this is only one part of the overall continuing and historic struggle for justice, rights, and sovereignty for tribal nations. And it is only the start of restoring safety in tribal communities and being able to heal from some of the violence, pain, and trauma endured over generations. Above all, so much more needs to be done to decrease the devastatingly high rates of violence against Indian women and children still occurring as we are here today. But this is a moment to celebrate, and it is all the more inspiring and moving when we consider that these VAWA provisions have, in effect, been 500 years in the making. I know that it will inspire survivors everywhere, as it has inspired me. This is how progress is won and achieved, with each victory, large or small, opening up the way for the next. So thank you so much again for allowing me to celebrate this progress with you today. And I hope you know that I will be there with you in this fight for the years to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Angelina, for being a supporter of Indian country and helping us to move this forward. And we're now going to go into our next segment. And I want to introduce and hand things over to our NCAI policy manager and policy lead for the National Security and Community Safety, Kelbie Kennedy. Kelbie is a citizen of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma, hailing from the town of Buffalo Valley on her nation's reservation. Since Kelbie joined NCAI in 2018, she's worked to reauthorize VAWA and support the NCAI task force on violence against women. Kelbie has put in countless hours working with survivors, tribal leaders, advocates, Hill staff, and members to get VAWA across the line. She worked to bring many of these groups together with one central goal: to make Indian country safer for all Native women and children. And we're happy to say that with the passage of VAWA, Kelbie has done just that. So I want to show my appreciation for all the work and the late nights that Kelbie has put in making sure this works. So really happy and proud to hand this over to Kelbie.
Okay, thank you so much, Dante. Really appreciate that, and appreciate everybody at home joining us here today for this celebration. It is so monumental, as Angelina said, for this to really have a realization of these important provisions for Indian country. And it's been a joy to still work at NCAI on VAWA since, as Dante said, I started working here in 2018. And it's been fantastic to work with the VAWA task force. And I just want to thank all of the survivors, their families, tribal leaders, advocates, allies that have helped educate me over the years, and appreciate being able to use that knowledge to help get VAWA across the line. Violence against Native women is very personal to me as a Choctaw citizen, but I can also share with you in southeastern Oklahoma, where I was born and raised, when I would go to Tushkahoma to be able to play stickball at our Labor Day festival, that when I'd walk into the bathroom, there would always be a piece of paper for the National Domestic Violence Hotline or the Strong Hearts Native Helpline. And you could see at the end of the piece of paper all of these phone numbers that everybody could tear off. And I can tell you, walking into that bathroom first thing in the morning, 30 minutes later, I would return and every single phone number would be taken from the wall. And that was something consistent. And I know that my community is not the only community in Indian country where that call for help, the need to have help, and the need for your nation to be able to exercise jurisdiction to protect people is imperative in our communities. And so I just want to express my personal thanks to everybody. It has taken all of you on the line, all of you who've come to VAWA task force meetings, all of you that have read those NCAI alerts, to call your senator, call your member of the House, make sure that you are beating down their door and they've heard you. And I just want to say thank you so much to all of the congressional staff, all of our allies who, again, like myself, spent so many hours in the night helping get this bill put together, giving comments. Your hard work and effort is really important to making sure that we got here today. And then finally, to all the great legislators, our allies that we've had on for this last segment, for casting the votes, protecting Native women, and ensuring that tribal sovereignty and jurisdiction is protected going forward, and that we were not left behind in this VAWA reauthorization. So with all that being said, I'd love to lead us into our next segment. So our second segment for today is to talk about what does VAWA actually restore? So in this entire segment, I want to hand it over to someone who, like myself and Carrie Colfer, spent many a late nights working to review legislation, working with staff members, working with advocates on the ground. Mary Kathryn Nagle. Mary Kathryn is a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, a lawyer, an author, and a playwright. She's a policy consultant for the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center, and again, worked very closely with Carrie and myself. As counsel or as the policy consultant to NIWRC, Mary Kathryn has drafted and filed numerous briefs in the United States Supreme Court, articulating the connection between preserving tribal sovereignty and ensuring safety for Native women and children. Mary Kathryn, along with NIWRC, is dedicated to protecting and enhancing sovereign rights of tribal nations and improving the lives of Native people all across the country. Mary Kathryn, thank you so much for joining us here today and for walking us through the first half of the tribal provisions. And I'll hand the floor over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kelbie. It is an honor to be here today with you all. And as Kelbie explained, I am an attorney that works for the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center, which is a national nonprofit whose primary focus is ending domestic violence and sexual assault against Native women. VAWA is one of NIWRC's main areas of focus. And I just want to give a shout out to NIWRC's senior policy affairs analyst, Carrie Colfer, who could not be here today. She's under the weather after not sleeping for the last several years working on VAWA. And I want to acknowledge that a lot of us on the call today have taken several trips to DC to meet on the Hill, or in the last 2 years, done a ridiculous number of Zoom meetings. Several of the VAWA implementing tribes have, offered up their judges, their victim advocates, their tribal leaders, members of their tribal council to join Kelbie, Carrie, and several, Don Stover and others of us who have held back-to-back meetings on the Hill in the last year or two to just make this happen. And so there are just so many incredible sovereignty experts who could not be here or today, or who are here today joining in, and just want to acknowledge that. But we have about 10 minutes here to just go through what is in this VAWA 2022. And as many of you know, there have been various versions of this bill, in the House and then in the Senate in November of 2019, and then back in the House. And now we have the legislation. So what's finally in the bill that's now law? If we can go to the first slide. Oh gosh, that's really tiny on my screen. Thank you. I was like, I don't have it up. Oh, thank you so much. Okay. I think it's just important to recognize that as much as we're celebrating VAWA, it is actually not a full fix to Oliphant. So it is not restoring jurisdiction over every single crime committed by a non-Indian who comes onto tribal lands. Just a reality we need to recognize. It also does nothing to rescind PL 280. And one thing that I think is important to keep in mind, many of us advocated really hard in drafting HR 1620 back in the day in the House. And that bill that passed the House did include elder abuse. It restored tribal criminal jurisdiction over elder abuse. Unfortunately, that did not make it into the final bill. I want to thank many of our tribal nations out there who wrote letters after the tribal title was released in December from the Senate committee, requesting that elder abuse be restored back into the bill. That didn't happen. Like Senator Murkowski said, this bill is historic. It achieves so many incredible things. Unfortunately, this was one of the things that we were not able to get in as VAWA crossed the finish line. So just something to keep in mind as we continue to explain the need for a full Oliphant fix. And just want to note too, VAWA is not automatic for every tribal nation. So your individual nation has to decide to implement VAWA. It's not something that just because this law is passed that every tribe is now exercising this jurisdiction. And if you take a close look at the legislation, there are specific requirements. Those are the same requirements that you'll find in the Tribal Law and Order Act that are sort of designed towards protecting a defendant's rights in tribal court. And so those are certain things that you have to provide that defendant, including the right to defense counsel, that if you're going to implement VAWA, you must provide. Next slide, please. So just something that we want to flag for everyone, because this came as a surprise the last minute to Kelbie, Carrie, and I, and others working on this, was that unfortunately there was a typo in the version that made it across the finish line. And they were basically saying in this new legislation that most of it will not go into effect until October 1st, 2022. And then they carved out some exceptions of certain provisions that will go into effect immediately. And the intent was to carve out the tribal jurisdiction section, the section that restores tribal criminal jurisdiction, to go into effect immediately, but accidentally referred to section 803, which refers to the Bureau of Prisons program. Clearly a typo. We raised this issue and unfortunately it did not get fixed. So, I think look at it as a positive right now. This gives us some time to prepare for the tribes that want to implement. It'll be necessary to update some of the tribal codes, but just know that the additional categories of criminal jurisdiction restored in this VAWA do not go into effect until October 1st. Next slide, please. So some major wins in this VAWA, in addition to the jurisdictional categories that I'll get to in a moment. I just want to mention that there is $6 million of funding, which is double the last reauthorization for the Tribal Access Program. It now requires the Attorney General to provide TA to the BIA and tribal law enforcement agencies on how to use TAP. Which is a huge help, and also removes this requirement that there was before, that this was only an option for areas where tribes, where there was criminal jurisdiction over Indian country, which was an obstacle to our native villages in Alaska. Also, this VAWA reauthorization makes the Bureau of Prisons program permanent. This is something that a lot of tribes and a lot of our VAWA advocates, many of you on the call, worked a lot with different senators and members of Congress to advocate for. So thank you for that. This has been a really amazing program for those tribes that have been able to use it. So this is now a permanent program. We don't have to get it reauthorized every year or into LOA. Tribes can now send tribal member defendants to federal prison, even if they don't have a correctional facility. The sentence requirements have been lowered. Previously, someone to be sent to a federal prison in this through this program, that person had to be sentenced 3 years imprisonment. Now that's just 1 year. And the tribal prisoner cap does stay at 100 people. Next slide, please. So these are the categories of criminal jurisdiction over non-Indians that tribes may now exercise once they implement VAWA. Tribes that have already implemented the previous VAWA don't have to do anything fancy to implement the new VAWA, except they may want to update their codes. And also any tribe can now implement this VAWA restoration. Of course, you may need to update your codes to provide the protections for defendants' rights and make sure your definitions of certain crimes match what's here in the statute. And of course, I think NIWC and NCAI and many other organizations like the Tribal Law and Policy Institute are very happy to help with all of that work. But things to note here. Tribal jurisdiction has been restored over assaults of tribal justice personnel. This includes non-Indian personnel. So there is an exception that we'll get to in a moment for VAWA does not restore tribal criminal jurisdiction over crimes where the victim is a non-Indian, right? We're talking VAWA restores tribal criminal jurisdiction over crimes where the perpetrator is a non-Indian. The one exception to that is if a tribal law officer is a non-Indian. And that was a very important exception that we really advocated for, because so many of our tribes, right, hire non-Indians to serve in their law enforcement. And if that law officer, regardless of their lack of citizenship in a tribal nation, is assaulted while working in the line of duty, we want to be able to prosecute that crime, right? We're also getting jurisdiction, restoring jurisdiction over child violence, crimes of child violence. Many of these definitions, if you look at the statute, frame it as defined by the tribe, which is great. So the statute itself doesn't give a similar limiting definition that we had before. So the statute's really deferring to the sovereign tribal nation to define what does child violence mean under that nation's law. The next one is coercion and commercial sexual act. Dating violence. Now, dating violence you'll recognize from VAWA 2013, just pointing out that it's still in there, right? That's not a new thing. Domestic violence, also from VAWA 2013, not new, but still in there. Obstruction of justice. This also includes non-Indians. And that would be, tampering with evidence or anything like that. Sex trafficking, this has been a major point for many of us advocates, especially as we've seen the rates of trafficking of our Native women and children and relatives skyrocket in areas with a lot of heavy presence of extractive industries. Also, sexual violence, right? And this was a huge issue before, and I'll get to it in a moment. But with the elimination of sufficient ties, which we'll get to in a moment, this now covers stranger sexual assault, which for so many of us was a huge crisis in our communities, that non-Indians would come onto our tribal lands knowing they could rape our daughters or our sisters with impunity, and without that domestic relationship or that dating relationship, it didn't fall within the purview of VAWA 2013. Well, now that jurisdiction has been restored. And finally, stalking, another huge issue. We know that's a precursor to much more violent forms of crime against our victims in Indian country, and violations of protection orders. This is also from VAWA 2013, and that's nothing new. Let's go on to the final slide. So additionally, it is important to note that as we'll, Alaska, of course, there'll be a separate, Debra's going to talk about the Alaska pilot project, which is incredibly exciting. But we also need to note that this has now opened the doors to tribes in Maine to implement this restored tribal criminal jurisdiction. And many thanks to all the advocates from Maine. I know Penobscot's put a lot of energy into advocating for that legislative change and sent tribal leaders and tribal court judges to the Hill. And these efforts definitely paid off. There's also what I just talked about a moment ago, sufficient ties. So the sufficient ties was in VAWA 2013. And essentially, if you go and look at what the language used to be, not only did you have to show that this person was in some sort of domestic dating relationship with the victim, but they had to also had to have sufficient ties. And so this kind of really limited, again, constituted another limit on the implementation of restored tribal criminal jurisdiction. We have done away with that in this VAWA 2022, major victory for tribal sovereignty and for our tribal nations. But there is still a limitation, and that's if the victim is non-native, as I mentioned before. The restored jurisdiction does not apply, except if it's obstruction of justice or assault on a tribal law officer, as I mentioned before. One other thing to note, more money, more funding is coming in the door for our tribal nation to implement VAWA. I know a lot of the tribes that implemented VAWA spent a lot of time and effort educating people on the Hill about the need for more money and just how expensive it is to implement this jurisdiction. We thank all the currently implementing tribes who did that heavy lifting and that hard work. We now have a $20 million increase. The authorization level is now $25 million. The current grant program is $5 million. This is a significant increase. We really hope tribes will take advantage of this and apply for this funding. The other really important thing to announce is that we do have a reimbursement program. It'll be administered through the DOJ, but now many tribes said, well, it's really, one thing to apply for a grant program where you have to budget what all the expenses will be. How do you predict whether one of the non-Indian defendants that you end up incarcerating in your jail or sentencing, what if he gets really sick and needs healthcare or needs a surgery? Tribes are undertaking that expense, and IHS doesn't cover it because you're talking about a non-tribal citizen, right? Those costs can now be submitted to the DOJ for reimbursement. Just another great resource and tool that we have because the VAWA implementing tribes, tribal nations spoke up, tribal leaders came to Congress and specifically requested this fix. And Kelbie has reminded me I have one more slide. So I think I've gone over 10 minutes, but I will be quick. We just want to note that there is a habeas provision, new habeas language in this VAWA 2022. Very important for any tribe implementing it to take a look at it and read it. It's short, it's straight to the point, but it's important to note, I'll say this first, that it requires a timely written notice to be served to defendants of their habeas rights. It's not quite clear what timely means, and we can all have a conversation about that. But obviously, maybe not obviously, but I would suggest not waiting until after someone has been sentenced to notify them that they have a right to habeas, right? And it has to be in writing. That's new, in writing. Second, you'll see here that the requirement to exhaust tribal court remedies has now been codified. It's been put in writing. And you'll note that it actually resembles a lot of the language you'll see in 28 USC 2254. Now, not all of it, right? And that's been an issue that some of us have raised and discussed. And I think overall, we're now going to be looking to how to ensure that this language we have in VAWA 2022 that mirrors some of the language of 28 USC 2254 is understood by federal courts to put tribal courts on parity and on par with the respect that state courts get for their state court convictions, and that we really do require defendants in tribal courts to exhaust those tribal court remedies unless there just simply is no appellate process available. There is no appeals court or something like that of that nature, which is basically what the standards say for state courts. And so, that's an important thing to take a look at for any implementing tribe. And I will still be around for questions at the end of the session. But overall, a major, major, major victory. It's a huge restoration of tribal sovereignty, something to celebrate for sure. And again, just a lot of thanks to NCAI and all the other advocates in the field who've worked really hard and tirelessly for this. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mayor Kathryn. Really appreciate all of your hard work for Indian country on the tribal provisions and getting this across the line, and your partnership as well. I'll answer one question that we did receive in the chat, just so folks are aware. We got a question about the materials for today, so we'll send up a follow-up email to everybody that registered for the event that will have materials and links that we're dropping in the chat, so you make sure that you have access to all of these great resources. And with that being said, I'd love to turn it over to our next speaker, who will be walking us through the fantastic Alaska provisions in VAWA. Debra O'Gara. Debra is Tlingit, Yupik, and Irish. She's worked in the legal field for over 31 years for several tribal nations and has obtained experience applying the law to a variety of situations, as well as developed several new initiatives. After relocating to Southeast Alaska in March of 2007, she began the task of building the Tlingit and Haida Court as the first magistrate, and then elected Chief Justice and Presiding Justice. Debra is a policy specialist for the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center and a PhD student at the University of Alaska Fairbanks in Indigenous Studies. It's so great to have you here with us, Debra. Thank you so much for sharing your wealth and knowledge and all of your work, and all in Michelle's Demert's work over at the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center, and Tammy Truitt-Drew. I know Alaska Native Women's Resource Center played a really great key role, along with so many others, in getting VAWA across the line, particularly in helping get the Alaska provisions off the line. So I'd love to hand the floor over to you to go over those great provisions. Debra?
Great. Thank you so much for that introduction, Kelbie. And I just want to echo what you just said as far as those who really did years and years of work, Michelle Demertz and Tammy Truitt-Drew. They are both actually, we're splitting our times today, which is why you get me, and they are addressing a UN parallel event this morning. So, and I also want to say I love being able to follow Mary Kathryn, because I can throw out half of what I've got written down to say, because she already covered it, which is great. So thanks, MK, for all of that. So I'll dive right into it. 9 years ago in 2013, as many of you have already heard, VAWA was reauthorized for the third time. Congress then reaffirmed the inherent right of tribal nations to prosecute all people who committed domestic violence against American Indians and Alaska Natives on tribal lands. Since that time, tribal courts across the country have held domestic violence offenders accountable in tribal courts and have brought justice and safety to many Indian victims who had previously had neither. Because of Alaska's unique history and legal issues, Alaska tribes were not able to take advantage of these protections back in 2013. And this all changed, as many people previous to me coming on have mentioned. This all changed last week with the 2022 reauthorization of VAWA and the inclusion of Subtitle B, also known as the Alaska Tribal Public Safety Empowerment Provision. And I don't think that Senator Murkowski and some of our other congressional leaders are still on, but and many leaders. And if I started naming everybody who has been involved with making sure that both Maine and Alaska were included in this reauthorization, my time would be up. So I won't. To tell you a little bit about Alaska, the rates of violence in rural Alaska makes clear the current situation and why this title is really so important. Despite making up only 19% of the state's population, Alaska Natives are 47% of reported rape victims in the state. And I say reported because we all know that a large portion of rapes go unreported. The largest number of victims per capita are Alaska Natives. And in 2019, the rate of American Indian Alaska Native women killed by men, both Native and non-Native, in Alaska was more than 3 times the rate for all women in Alaska and nearly 7 times the rate for white women. Now, I don't want to spend all of my time on statistics because we all know that it's bad. It's bad all over, and it's particularly bad here, especially when you consider that there's a lack of law enforcement in nearly 40% of our rural communities. And the challenges that we have continue to grow, especially with children and tribal leaders who are far too often the first responders when violence or murder has occurred in our villages. So what does this reauthorized bill actually do for us here in Alaska? It does the same thing that it did in 2013 for the lower 48 tribes. It clarifies tribal authority to address civil and criminal matters, including the protection orders and violent crimes committed against Alaska Natives in their communities. And as MK already said, it also includes crimes against law enforcement, whether they're Native or not Native. It creates resources and tools to address domestic violence and all of the qualifying crimes that were on the previous list. The one thing that the Alaska pilot project that does not do is it does not alter in any manner or respect the state jurisdiction or authority. The state of Alaska still maintains all of its jurisdiction, all of its rights, and I would say all of its responsibilities. This special domestic violence criminal jurisdiction over crimes is not new, as has already been mentioned several times. Many tribes outside of Alaska have already paved the way, and we here in Alaska and in Maine are able to start from where they are now. We don't have to go through some of the same barriers and challenges that have already been figured out. Soon after the first tribal, for instance, soon after the first tribal project, pilot project was allowed in 2013, the U.S. Attorney's Office issued a notice and solicited comments on a criteria that they had drafted up. This initial proposed criteria was so complex and burdensome that it actually discouraged qualified tribes from applying. There was a huge outcry from tribes and lots of input, and eventually what was finalized is a streamlined and much more realistic criteria for pilot project applications. This was the process down south, and we hope that we are able to now jump on and start from where the lower 48 tribes are at now. Doesn't mean that there's not any room for improvement, because of course there always is. So how does it operate here in Alaska? First, the U.S. Attorney General will select up to 5 Alaska tribes per year to participate in the pilot project, with a preference on those tribal communities where the population is predominantly Native or where there is no permanent state law enforcement presence. The Attorney General will look at the tribal applications and determine and make sure that any participating tribe has the capacity to protect defendants' rights under the civil rights, essentially the due process. And that's already been covered, so I won't go into that. Each tribe applying and or wanting to be a pilot project will need to have a plan for prosecuting non-Indians, as well as having a law enforcement prosecutors, defense attorneys, and some kind of court justice system. Now, that may seem like a pretty high wall to climb, especially for some of our small communities that might not have, but maybe one of those things. But there's also the opportunity to collaborate with neighbors and join forces so that 2, 3, 4, or a whole region can collaborate. So, and as we start having more discussions here in Alaska about how we can implement and help support these pilot projects, we can talk more with individual tribes. Tribes will also have to have written and public criminal code, as well as court rules, policies and procedures. And sometimes the tribe may need to look at their constitution to see if it needs to be updated. There should also be a plan. And I was happy to hear, I had forgotten about the access to federal prisons that's included in the new reauthorization. So that's one thing. Tribes may also want to consider looking at contracting or collaborating with local treatment centers and rehabilitation services, as well as victim services, and may also want to explore some of the restorative justice options that are being created and evolving. The other thing that's going to soon be coming out is an announcement for the Alaska Tribal Public Safety Advisory Committee, which is going to be really, really very helpful for the Alaska tribes to keep an eye on and join if you're able. What this committee will do is it will be comprised of tribes, law enforcement, advocates, attorneys, and others who can work together on common issues and help share resources. It'll be a good time to get more information and then just look for what capacities your tribe may need to get more resources on and build up in order to start your own pilot project. And of course, the funding, as Mary Kathryn indicated, has been increased. And while it's not an unlimited pot, it certainly gets our tribal communities' foot in the door, and the DOJ, other grants like CTAS will also continue to be available. So next steps for the Alaska tribes, and I see that there is, I think, well over 200. So I have to assume that a third to a half of the folks that are listening are affiliated or are from Alaska. And so I'm speaking to you, tribal leaders. Look for the Dear Tribal Leader letter from the AG's, from the US Attorney General's office. That will start the process. What they need to do first is to develop those criteria that I talked about at the very beginning of this presentation. And the tribal input at that early stage is going to be vital. And this is where we can learn from our lower 48 tribes who have already gone through this. We want to ensure that this program is set up for success and not for failure. And our tribal input is going to be vital. In these early days, we want to make sure that the AG's office takes the approach that that there's trust, that our tribal communities and tribal governments know what our individual capacity is, that the criteria allows us to self-certify our capacities, and that we fully benefit from the trials and errors and lessons learned from our lower 48 brothers and sister tribes. In this way, our Alaska tribes now are able to start increasing on our own safety in our villages. All Alaskans will benefit. I know that there's already and has been concern from within the state, and I just keep repeating, Once our tribal communities are safe and violence has been reduced, that increases safety and decreases violence throughout the entire state. So what's good for the tribes is good for the entire state. And with that, I can stay online and help with any questions. Thank you for asking me.
Okay, thank you so much, Debra. I know that we have a lot of really great folks here that probably want to ask you a ton of questions. I know that we want to make sure that we get the last two folks that we have on our agenda in today, but if you're willing to stick around for questions, we'll definitely be open for that. And folks, if you want to ask Debra questions while we're going through these last few speakers, please feel free to put them in the chat. As I mentioned earlier, Debra is a wealth of knowledge, and making sure to get information out to Alaska tribes will be very important to all of us across Indian country, and making sure that you have the best way to move forward with VAWA implementation. So thank you so much, Debra. So with that being said, I'd love to move us into our next segment, which is, so we've talked about celebrating VAWA. We've talked about what does VAWA actually mean. Our next segment is what's next for Indian country. So the first person I want to introduce and introduce a message from them for this next segment is Pascua Yaqui tribe Attorney General Alfred Urbina, or as many of you know him as Fred. Fred's a citizen of the Pascua Yaqui tribe and has practiced law and worked in the field of criminal justice and law enforcement for over 20 years. He served as the Attorney General of the Pascua Yaqui tribe in the past and has come back to his nation. He's a veteran of the U.S. Army and has previously worked for the Arizona police officers and has worked as a chief prosecutor and deputy prosecutor for the Pascua Yaqui tribe and a law clerk for the Pima County attorney. When VAWA was first, I want to say first reauthorized, but when VAWA was reauthorized in 2013, Pascua Yaqui was one of the first pilot tribes to ever exercise this type of VAWA jurisdiction. And so Fred was at the forefront of working with Pascua Yaqui to make sure that they were prepared. And they actually had the first jury trial under VAWA under Pascua Yaqui. So what I'd like to do is play a message from Attorney General Urbina to really talk to us about what are the next steps that his nation took after 2013 and what are the next steps that your nation could be taking now. With that all being said, I'll turn it over to the great message from Attorney General Alfred Urbina.
Good afternoon. My name is Fred Urbina. I'm the Attorney General for the Pascua Yaqui tribe. I'm here to talk about the tribe's experience implementing VAWA 2013 and how we can help with the implementation of VAWA 2022. What I'll do now is I'll share my screen just to help make a few points. And for our tribe, we began implementation as a pilot tribe in 2013. To date, we have had 107 cases investigated, 80 cases that were prosecuted in tribal court. And we've had, I believe, close to 40 convictions of non-Indian offenders of violent crimes on the reservation. Those 107 investigations have involved tribal children. They've involved females and males, and the implementation has had a major impact on our reservation. I believe it's had a deterrent effect. I believe we've addressed crime on our reservation as comprehensively as possible. After the 5-year pilot program, we worked with NCAI and the other VAWA tribes to put out a report. In that report, we noted that there were several gaps in the law. Those gaps included what are now called the covered crimes in VAWA 2022, crimes that involved law enforcement officers, crimes that involved children, and also court personnel. And so, and also sex assault and stalking. And so those gaps in the law based on the 2013 implementation has led to additional restored authority. What you see on the screen is one of the first jury trials that we had. We've had 3 jury trials to date, 2 ending in convictions of non-Indian offenders. And the other points I wanted to make, not only that we knew we had these cases that were happening on our reservation, we couldn't address them. And these cases were not being prosecuted by the federal government, and they were not being prosecuted by the state government. That's important to note, to really drive home the point that there really is not going to be another jurisdiction that's going to be able to handle these cases, as well as a tribal court will. A tribal court with tribal justice personnel that know your community, that know the people that are on your reservation, and who will be able to deal with this day in and day out. Previously, tribes have tried to work with their federal partners or state partners. They've developed workaround programs, piecemeal solutions that haven't really solved these problems. The restored jurisdiction gives you the ability to do what you've always done, do what your tribe has always done pre-Oliphant, and that's protecting your community, doing what you have to do as tribal leaders to ensure that your community is safe for your tribal members. That's really the first duty of any tribe, is to ensure the safety of the community. There's a lot of tools that we have today that will help you do that. Some of these tools have been developed over the years, like SORNA, the Adam Walsh Child Protection and Safety Act in 2006. Many tribes have implemented that law successfully. There's the Tribal Law and Order Act with many provisions that increases the sentencing authority of tribal courts up to 3 years and 9 years total per case. There's, of course, VAWA 2013 that gave or restored tribal jurisdiction for dating violence, domestic violence, and the enforcement of orders of protection. Today, we also have the Tribal Access Program, which is a Department of Justice program. That law is now codified in VAWA 2022, and it gives the tribes the authority to share information, to use the NCIC to share orders of protection and your convictions, your violent crime convictions with your state and federal partners. So we have the tools, we have the restored authority. It's our contention that once you start to exercise this authority, you're going to have the ability to address violent crime on your reservation that will help. It's our contention that once you start to do that, you start to reduce the likelihood of these cases of missing and murdered Indigenous relatives, women and girls, as well as men, the violent crime that is not being controlled, leads to additional violent crime, it leads to homicides, it leads to people going missing. We can start to make those correlations, we can start to see the connections. It's not hard for us to do that. So for us, we believe that the implementation of VAWA 2013 has helped us reduce the likelihood of homicides and missing and murdered relatives on our reservation. So it's another reason why you should consider the implementation of VAWA. Our tribe has developed a implementation guide that we developed in 2014 with the University of Arizona. Professor Melissa Tatum helped us develop this guide, and it walks each tribe through some of the considerations that you should think about as you weigh whether or not you want to implement VAWA 2013 or the restored additional covered crimes in VAWA 2022. The other important piece of that is, like I mentioned before, is that the Tribal Access Program is now codified. This is also part of your sovereign authority sharing information with the outside world, off reservation, of convictions, both non-Indians and tribal members who violate your laws or who have orders of protection. You have the authority and you have now the ability and the resources to ensure that you're able to do that. It's very important. This TAP program is a very important piece of the implementation of VAWA because you need it to actually look at the criminal history of the people that are being arrested and brought into your system. These are non-Indian offenders who you may not know what their criminal history is, and it will be very important for you to keep your community safe by understanding who they are and what crimes they've committed in the past. That's the end of my time, but I'd like to thank everybody who's been part of the reauthorization of VAWA 2022. It's an exciting time. It's gonna help us reduce crime on our reservation. We know that there was gaps in VAWA 2013, and VAWA 2022 will help us fill the gaps in our system and help keep our community safe. Thank you all. Have a wonderful week. Thank you, NCAI, for putting this together, and thank you to the other speakers for helping us walk through this important new piece of legislation. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so very much, Attorney General Urbina. Fred, always a fantastic presentation. For those of you that don't know, there in the chat box, there is the implementation guide that Fred mentioned. All of you can download that. We'll include that in the follow-up email that we send to all of the attendees today, along with Fred's contact information. We want to make sure he's offered to help other nations. I know that they're going to do a couple of trainings across Indian country about VAWA implementation this year. And so he's given me permission to share his contact information. So I'm going to take him up on that, but really appreciate him sending a message to us today. So for our next speaker, what I'd like to do is introduce our last two speakers of the day, Sally Waters and Kelly Stoner. Sally had an emergency this morning and is not able to join us, but I wanted to make sure that she remained on the agenda in the slide just to let all of you know that Sally is NCAI's main point of contact for the Intertribal Technical Assistance Working Group for the Violence Against Women Act. Sally took over the great job that Esther Librado has done before. So we'll make sure to include her contact information, but if you would love to get on the email list for the ITWIG or learn more about the ITWIG, Sally would be the best person to contact at NCAI. And so with that being said, Kelly's gonna take over this great part about the ITWIG. And so let me introduce her very quickly. So Kelly Stoner is of Cherokee ancestry and serves as the TLPI Victims Advocate Legal Specialist. She's a graduate of the University of Oklahoma College of Law, and for the past 20 years, she's taught at the North Dakota School of Law and Oklahoma City University School of Law, where she taught American Indian, tribal law, and domestic violence related classes. She directed the University of North Dakota Native American Law Project that serves clients of the Spirit Lake Reservation with a caseload of targeted domestic violence and sexual assault cases. We're really happy to have Kelly join us today to share all of her great knowledge with us about the technical assistance and the resources that the ITWIG can offer your tribal nation here today. So I'll turn it over to Kelly. Thank you so much again, Kelly, for joining us.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Okay,
yes.
Great. Thank you, Kelbie and NCAI for having me, for inviting me to say a few words about the Intertribal Working Group. Yeah, I see the slideshow coming up. The Intertribal Working Group is an extraordinary group working either with or for tribes to implement or prepare themselves to exercise or prepare themselves to exercise this special tribal criminal jurisdiction over non-Indians who commit certain crimes in their Indian country. You've heard a whole host of, you've received a whole host of information about the 2022 VAWA reauthorization. Mary Kathryn gave a presentation about the categories of crimes now covered. So I want to first, I'll go rather quickly because I know time is a precious commodity here, but I want to start with, if we could go to the next slide, the issue that we're all grounded in here, a couple of slides, and then I'll move right into who is the ITWIG, how many tribes are implementing. And you've heard speakers that went on before me speak about this 1978 United States Supreme Court case, Oliphant, and how that case held that tribes had no criminal jurisdiction over non-Indians who committed crimes in Indian country. And almost all of the speakers have touched on this. And ever since 1978, up until 2013 of the VAWA reauthorization, these restrictions placed by the federal government on tribes to exercise this jurisdiction, criminal jurisdiction over non-Indians remained. And then we see it slowly getting lifted. The restrictions are being loosened. They were loosened in 2013, and we see even more loosening of those federal restrictions placed on this inherent sovereign power of the tribe to prosecute non-Indians committing crimes in Indian country. We heard Ms. Jolie talk about infrequent federal prosecutions. In other words, tribes that were relying on the federal prosecutions or state prosecutions in PL 280 tribes. The numbers continue to skyrocket. The number of assaults and violations against Indian women in Indian country. So that's the issue here, the big issue. And as Mayor Kathryn told you, this is not, even VAWA 2022 reauthorization is not a complete overhaul, but it is a partial overruling of that Supreme Court case of Oliphant. Exciting stuff. Next slide. All of the work of the ITWIG that I'm going to get to in the very next slide, the Intertribal Working Group, is grounded with a deep honor and respect for tribal sovereignty. The way this group and tribes exercising this jurisdiction over non-Indians, it's been spectacular. It's been a variety of different approaches as tribes match up their tribal codes to reflect their customs and traditions and their concepts and beliefs in how native victims need to heal and that healing path. Next slide. So with those first two slides to give us the context, I do want to, again, say what an extraordinary journey I've been on since 2013, having the honor to work with the Intertribal Working Group, or the ITWIG. Again, it was formed as a result of VAWA 2013's reauthorization and this loosening of restrictions on a tribe's inherent criminal authority to prosecute non-Indians committing crimes in Indian country. Approximately 70 tribes participate. And what you see right here, some of you might recognize yourself because we've got some long-term ITWIG working group members, I'm sure, in the audience. This is the very first ITWIG meeting. The ITWIG has biannual meetings, so much more though. It is just this think tank of brilliant folks working in Indian country, exchanging views, exchanging information and advice on how tribes can move forward. Challenges arise, the tribes come together, they talk about workarounds, how they can address particular issues that may be unintended consequences of the statute. Again, all focusing on keeping Native victims safer in Indian country. Next slide. we have so many calls to also monthly calls. There's just so much going on with the ITWIG. I wanted to show you this slide so you can see, I think we actually have 31 tribes that are currently exercising. You'll see this special domestic violence criminal jurisdiction. That's the SBDCJ part. VAWA 2022 changed that term. It will now be special tribal criminal jurisdiction, I believe. But again, we have 31 tribes to date that are exercising, not planning to exercise, they're actually exercising this criminal jurisdiction over non-Indians. Next slide. So what does a tribe need to do if they want to? They're not exercising yet. They want to think about it. They want to look at their codes. We put together a list of questions right here that a tribe could ask itself. I'm happy to see that the slides will go out to everyone viewing today. Just important questions to consider as you move forward in analyzing whether exercising this criminal jurisdiction is a good fit for your tribal community, and some of the requirements that you will have to address if you want to implement this criminal jurisdiction over non-Indians committing certain crimes in Indian country. So you'll get a copy of that. And let's go to the next slide. Trying to wrap up quickly here, Kelbie. I know we're running behind. There is a technical assistance team that supports the ITWIG, and I'll tell you what types of TA we provide, but I wanted you to get a look at who these folks are and which organizations they come from. Again, Kelbie pointed out Sally Waters with NCAI, also an NCAI consultant, the Honorable Steve Acock. He's been with the ITWIG since the very beginning, just like many of us. With the Tribal Law and Policy Institute, we see Jerry Gardner, the executive director, myself, Chia Halpern-Biso, and Virginia Davis, who is a consultant for TLPI. And last but not least, I believe I heard Mary Kathryn mention this name, Dawn Stover, who is the executive director of the Alliance of Tribal Coalitions to End Violence. And Dawn is an integral part of this TA team as someone who keeps the team and the ITWIG focused on the needs of victims, re-traumatization of victims, the victim's healing process, unintended consequences of statutes to victims, just a really important piece of the TA team. Next slide. What type of TA does the team provide to any tribe that wants to explore implementation of this special tribal criminal jurisdiction, or any tribe that is already exercising that has questions? We will review draft tribal codes. Mary Kathryn pointed out with the new VAWA reauthorization, we may see some tribes needing to edit, redraft some pieces of their tribal code. So we stand ready as a TA team to provide technical assistance on that topic in any way we can. Also addressing specific questions about VAWA's jury requirements, which some tribes have to work really hard on. There has to be a cross-section of a jury pool selected in these particular kinds of cases. So we have experts on tap for that. And to help address any issues that may come up with the investigation or prosecution of individual cases, we are here to bounce ideas off of, to strategize with, always leaving the ultimate decision, though, with the tribe, because the tribes know best how to address the needs in their tribal communities. If you would like to access any of these free technical assistance resources, there's Sally Waters' email there. If you want to join the ITWIG, I would highly recommend it, staying up to date on all these issues as we all move forward together. You will also do that by emailing Sally Waters at ncai.org, or you can email Chia, CHIA, at TLPI.org, either one, and just let them know you want to join the ITWIG or that you want TA or both. All right, next slide. Just a few resources here. I'll breeze through these really fast with Kelbie. Next slide. You'll see here a couple of reports from NCAI that really delve into special domestic violence criminal jurisdiction. That's the 2013 model. And as Fred was saying earlier, you'll find many stories from tribes about barriers to implement this jurisdiction, the victims they couldn't protect, and you'll see those that report on the left. On the right, you see some TLPI publications on drafting tribal statutes to meet the requirements of 2013 VAWA. These will need to be updated, and also tribes that want to think about setting up a domestic violence court or a domestic violence docket to better meet the needs of their citizens. You'll find that publication as well. Next slide is a website created by TLPI. There you see the web address for it. It's all things tribal protection orders, about drafting. Again, these will need to be updated to meet any particular changes of VAWA 2022. Although the protection order piece and the violation of protection orders, as Mayor Kathryn pointed out, stay pretty much the same. So this is still going to be very applicable to those of you who want to think about revamping your protection order forms. Next slide. And the funding opportunities that were mentioned by the Office on Violence Against Women, you'll have this slide as we move forward. Just know there are particular funding opportunities that focus exclusively on the needs of tribes that are exercising this special tribal criminal jurisdiction. And with that, I'm going to take a breath. If you have questions, please put those in the box. I'm going to turn it back over to you, Kelbie. Thank you so much for inviting me, and thanks everyone.
Okay. Thank you so much, Kelly. Really appreciate you sharing all of your expertise and all of the great work that the ITWIG does. I know that several tribal nations will be reaching out to you and Sally in order to get this great technical assistance going forward, and Chia as well, to even join the ITWIG in general, or the emails, all the emails and phone calls that you have going out. I will again note that we'll make sure to include all of the links in the chat as well in the follow-up email. So I know Kobe Carr is putting a lot of great links into the chat. We'll make sure that you have access to those in the follow-up email. Before I turn it over to Dante, I really want to quickly acknowledge all of the work of the Tribal Domestic Violence Coalitions. I can't believe I didn't say Don Stover's name earlier, from the Alliance of Tribal Coalitions to End Violence. Tribal coalitions played a huge part in getting VAWA across the line, and I just wanted to take space and breath to acknowledge and thank them for all of their hard work. They reached out to, they made sure to reach out to tribal leaders and advocated for victims that they are helping every single day, and make sure that we could get VAWA across the line. So with that all being said, I'd love to hand the floor back to my CEO, Dante, for his closing remarks, and want to say Yaqui to everybody. Thank you so much for allowing me to help moderate, to work on these issues, and I look forward to continue to working with you on violence against Native women issues at the National Congress of American Indians for many more years to come. Yaqui. Thank you so much, Dante. The floor is now yours.
Kelbie, and thank you for all of our speakers today for the great presentation. We're going to close this out in the same way we started, so I'm just going to hand this right over to Chief Williams, if you don't mind.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
We sure can.
Thank you very much. It has been a real good day, and all of the people that have been involved in this effort, there's too numerous to say thank you, and I'd like to thank the resolution process at NCAI that made a big difference for our Alaska tribes, and all the hard work from Melissa Demert and Lloyd Miller and Heather Kendall, and and all of the tribal leaders from Alaska that really got this effort going out of the meeting that we had in Fairbanks with the Tribal Leaders Summit. And we appreciate that enough is enough. And but with our creator's guidance, we have gotten to this point, and we will continue to strengthen our tribes in Alaska and elsewhere in the nation to make sure we have healthy communities once again, and strengthen tribal sovereignty and our communities to deal with these issues. So I'll start off with the prayer in my language, and please pray in your own way, and we respect that. And we respect all of the 574 tribal nations in this country. And we deal with these issues in a similar way, but a lot of them are very different at the local level. Welcome to Anaput, Echanaput, Chali, Nunaput, Chali, 20 out of Mafki. Koya come to Chali with Atakwach, Natin, Koya couldn't Jahang on beach of Jesus. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief Williams. And I want to thank everybody today for joining us. We were here to celebrate, learn what's in the legislation, and talk about moving forward. And we don't do enough celebrating in Indian country. So I do appreciate everybody who joined us for that portion of it. And we look forward to continuing to work with everyone. We know this is not perfect. This legislation needs work, but it really does build another strong layer on the foundation from 2013. And we know we have more work to do, but we do have really dedicated and committed people, some of whom you've heard from today. And we also have a task force that has done great work and will continue, and a working group that will do the same. So we have a lot of momentum. We have a lot of commitment. So please continue to join us in this fight, this movement, to be able to keep improving and making permanent VAWA for all Native people. So thank you for your time today. Thank you for the conversation. Everybody have a good morning, afternoon, evening. We will see you all soon.